There have been some very plush times and some very, very hard times in the past. And thinking about what that experience of constant ups and downs has meant is important to us. I want to think especially about, say, a few things about the period around the first great burst of membership around 1900 and 1901, about the explosion of membership in World War I. And the IAM became really in the forefront of the country's entire labor movement, only to suffer after the war a catastrophic loss of membership. I can remember when I was in 459, the most respected old-timer who sort of took me under his wing and taught me how to function in that union, had been there in the great strike of 1922. And again he would say, "You want to strike? Let me tell you what happened to the machinists in 1922 on all the railroads of America." This was the great showdown from that epoch. And I want to think about the expansion of membership again in the 1930s, when suddenly the center of gravity in this union shifted from the railroads, which is basically where it had been born, to the aircraft industry, along with a lot of growth in general metalworking and manufacturing around the country. After the 1930s, and the award of the American Federation of Labor in 1935, awarding jurisdiction over the airframe industry, as technical people call it, to the IAM, what a new lease on life this gave to this organization. And with it, the great upheavals of World War I, World War II, that came with it. And then I want to look somewhat at the sharp declines of recent years. You just heard from President Buffenberger yesterday that the most recent membership figures seem to be considerably lower than the 2000 ones that I have here. Let me say these figures all include both dues-paying members and retirees. So this, in some extent, gives some larger figures than you might see some other places. But as we've been through those ups and downs, I want to think about 5 questions, very briefly, 5 questions that machinist members have wrestled with over the course of those 115 years. The first one has had a sort of a weird, grotesque comeback in recent years. Are we a fraternal organization, just of machinists and highly skilled craft workers, or are we a fighting union? That was the big issue fought out between the founding in 1888 and about 1901, when the great growth of the union began. The second was how, in the face of stiff employer resistance in the early 20th century, could they make the union movement grow, and what should it be looking for when it grows? What were the objectives of that movement? The third was how to deal with a post-war counterattack in depression and a decline of membership much more rapid than any increase than had been seen prior to that time. The fourth was whether this union should remain a craft union or join in the campaign for industrial forms of organization, all grades of workers, the great issue of the 1930s. And finally, how do you cope with the new mobility of capital? What do you do when your boss can pack up shop and move it any place? Those 5 questions, I think, are the center of what I want to talk about. To start, first of all, on that fraternal order issue. I looked into the records of machinists in the late 19th and early 20th century. I see a very peculiar breed of human beings. First of all, unlike people in other jobs, they were never afraid of new technology. They made it. They were building it, inventing it. And indeed, the old copies of the Machinist Monthly Journal are filled with technical articles. An important part of being in the trade was knowing what it was that you were building, knowing what it was that you were creating, and how those jobs were done. That kind of technical expertise was right at the center of their activity. Secondly, the machinists in their early days produced an enormous number of writers. When you're asked to write down your history, this is an old tradition. This is where we started. You see Machinist, the great philosopher of the 8-hour day, Ira Stewart, machinist by trade, writing on why the 8-hour day was what was most important to workers and helping guide a 50-year struggle to bring that. He did this writing in the 1860s and 70s, by the way. Machinists always in the forefront of the great debates going on in the labor movement. And if you look in the old issues of the Machinist Monthly Journal, there is more world news in there, more debate about labor and socialist movements in other countries than you can shake a stick at, all of which was part of the discussions that those groups carried on. There was also, from the earliest days of the Union, and this is very interesting given the fact that the original people who qualified were all men. First significant admission of women was about 1903, 1911, really opening the doors to women members. But those original members placed a great stake on the role of women's auxiliaries. And indeed, through the early history of the IAM, the wives of union members loomed very large. They had 3 full pages in the Machinist Monthly Journal every single month when it came out. Notice the heading, Women's Sphere, and under it that word in Latin, ubique, everywhere. And indeed, this is precisely the kind of articles that you will find in here about politics of the day, about union struggles of the day, and indeed all of those who were involved in the bitter battles of 1920, 21, 22, when the Union after World War I was fighting for its life, will agree that what kept them alive and gave them fighting hope was the role of the women's auxiliaries in seeing to it that food was on the table, in seeing to it that the neighborhood knew what was going on, that literature got around, that they were always central to all of these struggles. But with all of this, there was a strong sense of exclusiveness in the early Machinist Union. Indeed, its original name, when it was founded in 1888 down in Atlanta, was the Order of United Machinists and Mechanical Engineers. And indeed, they looked upon themselves as the machine builders, building locomotives and repairing them. This is what they were doing here, rather than machine operators at the time. But that led to a remarkable sense that because of our technical knowledge, because of all of these debates we're in, because of the skills involved, we're really a bit better than anybody else in the industrial world. And indeed, this was caught very neatly by a very famous machinist from Scranton, Pennsylvania, named Terence Powderly, who was the head of the Knights of Labor for many years, the biggest labor organization in the land. When he was young, belonged to an early machinist union up in Scranton about 1870. They tried to make a merger with the local Boilermakers, and the membership voted it down. Nah, Boilermakers, they make a lot of noise, they sweat, it's dirty in there where they all are. So Terence Powderly wrote on that occasion, "Aristocrats of labor, we are up on airs and graces. We wear clean collars, cuffs, and shirts. Likewise, we wash our faces. There's no one quite so good as we in all the world of labor. the Boilermaker we despise, although he is our neighbor. There indeed was some of this early sense of what kind of an exclusive group, as I say, I'm beginning to hear echoes of that again, some places around the land. But the place where the exclusiveness cut deepest and sharpest was in the exclusion of black workers. Indeed, the exclusion of anybody that could not, according to the qualification, the ritual, which one pledged not to introduce anyone for membership who was not an upright, honest Caucasian journeyman. This ritual was especially important given the foundation of the Union on the railroads, which were the biggest single non-agricultural employer of black workers in the South. And indeed, the most systematically, scientifically segregated. Each job was categorized by race on the Southern railroads. And the early Machinist Union adopted that exclusive policy. And indeed, when it was admitted into the American Federation of Labor in 1895, the AFL said, you can't come in here with that in your Constitution. They took it out of the Constitution and put it in the ritual. So the practice remained indeed until 1948. We'll get later on to how it came to be broken down at that time. But as exclusive as the early craft organization was, it soon found itself involved in more and more fierce battles with the employers, especially as the hard times of the 1890s came along. And employers started more and more breaking down journeymen's jobs and specializing them, getting people doing just one operation at a time, trying to get them to run 2 machines. It takes a long time for a cut on a lathe. All right, let me put a drill press behind you. On you go, so that you won't get too idle. It made a lot of bosses very antsy that on a lot of machinist jobs, they couldn't see much sweat on the shirt. And so let's see if we can conjure up a bit more of it there. This question of a time and motion study comes in then. New scientific management techniques start out in the machinist trade. And that led to an increasing number of battles in which the IAM answered with establishing rules of its own. Every member promised that he would never work for less than the standard wage set up by the union. He would never work piecework. Oh, boy, that was a rough one to hold on to. The employers are trying to put in piecework everywhere. The union rule is no. And famous rule, one man, one machine. I will never operate 2 machines at once, was another thing. There was pledged sort of on the honor of the individual craftsman. When you've joined the union, this is what you will do. So the bosses started firing people like mad for doing that, and this led to strike after strike after strike, finally ending up in a huge strike across the whole of the country, although the heart of it was Chicago. Chicago, around 1900, was the storm center of the machinist union in this country. And there, that strike led the National Metal Trains Association to sit down with the national officers of the IAM and work out a nationwide contract for the machinist trade called the Murray Hill Agreement, with standard rates for every area, with a 9-hour day. 8-hour day is what the workers had demanded, but now for the first time they got a 9-hour day written into that contract. And it seemed to many of the leaders of the union that if they were ready to show their stuff when the chips were down, they could persuade the employers to come to terms and live rationally together under an agreement that in the end would be beneficial to everybody. every machine shop in town would have to pay the same wages. So there wouldn't be any undercutting of one company by another in wage competition. The agreement was very promising, got a lot of publicity throughout the country, but within a year was starting to break down. And employers increasingly turned to open shop associations to try and drive unions out of their cities. There is a wonderful book now by a man named Milligan. Anybody here from the Twin Cities? Aha, okay. Called A Union Against Unions, about the Citizens Alliance of Minneapolis. An association of employers there that brought themselves together so that every boss would back up every other boss in case of a strike. And so they could identify workers who belong to unions, get rid of them, get them out of town, as a matter of fact. And indeed, in Minneapolis, they're successful in keeping unions out of the city from about 1906 to 1934. And the great Teamsters strike broke through the wall, in bloody physical battle, broke through the wall of barring unions that had been set up in that city. Here was a major counterattack then that made a lot of people wonder if this Murray Hill formula was really going to work after all. And it led to strong factionalism inside the Machinist Union in the first decade of the 20th century. A very powerful wing grew up, committed to socialism as the objective of the union. Support the Socialist Party in national politics, support solidarity with other unions in our struggles, and make ourselves part of a worldwide movement with a vision of a very different kind of society in which we might live. At the convention of 1911, that faction won, called themselves the Progressives, and put in William Johnson of Providence, Rhode Island, as president of the Grand Lodge of the Union. It was a ferocious convention. I've looked down the voting list, and you could tell anybody who voted one way on this issue, you knew how he was going to vote on all the other issues that went through. It was so sharply divided. But this launched a period of intense political activity. And although it didn't hang on with the Socialist Party very long, political struggle remained from that point on a central theme of the Machinist Union. And the struggle to win legislation to improve conditions for all working people came to the forefront. And with that came the effort to do just the opposite of that little jingle that I told you about. The effort to build solidarity with other unions in the metal trades. And the machinists played a central role in building metal trades councils so that molders and boilers. The boss had to send a report on that worker to the Central Labor Bureau. And you notice here the report on Frank Barst. Skill, excellent. Production, excellent. Conduct, excellent. Reason for leaving, lazy. Okay? This one's a little more obvious. How to do that? How do you do that one? Okay? But this is what goes on. Any other person thinking of hiring? Aha! That guy's lazy. Here is Arthur Davis. Skill, excellent. Production, excellent. Conduct, fair. Reason for discharge, labor agitator. Here's the record then that would be used to follow anyone around the land. And the records that are used throughout the 1920s to see to it that when this union lost membership catastrophically, it stayed down throughout the decade of the 1920s. Its one great stronghold remained the railroads, where they'd become practically 100% in the machine shops during the war. It lasted until 1922. And the railroads were re-privatized and immediately set out to break down the union standards that had been established during the war itself. In 1922, they forced out all of the shop crafts, about 344,000 workers, the biggest single strike in American history. At that time, and indeed in proportionate terms, still the biggest one. Coast to coast, it took place. And this is the one the old-timers who taught me the tools of the trade remembered and knew about. You want to know a strike? You should have been with us in St. Paul. One of these guys, well, I was 5 years old. What did you do in the strike? Well, when they brought in scab-driven locomotives, I would go out with soap onto the incline and soap the tracks. And the train would start up. Why did a 5-year-old have to do this? Because they had an injunction prohibiting any man, woman, dog, cat, or cow from coming within hundreds of yards of the railroad tracks over the course of this, handed down by Attorney General Dougherty of the United States. And under this injunction, which prohibited any promotion of the strike finally collapsed, and most of the railroad workers, virtually all except those on the Baltimore and Ohio, went back with no unions after that. In this context, once again, the IAM promoted a broad social vision of an alternative to the society they were in. No longer did they say, we need socialism, but they got very specific as to what they needed. We do need government ownership of the railroads. That's been proven in America. And it's been proven that under private hands, they will devastate their workers and indeed many of the shippers, like the farmers. We do need strong labor representation in every state and in the federal government. And the machinists were a central group in forming the Committee for Progressive Political Action to work together with the needle trades unions and the United Mine Workers to promote an agenda of social insurance, the kind of thing that's being taken away from us today, and of pro-labor legislation, an end to this use of injunctions in industrial disputes. Out of this also they promoted workers' education, being major contributors to Brookwood College up in New York, where workers would go from all over the country to, in effect, study what was going on. And notice those Brookwood students were the pioneers of the next great wave of struggles in the 1930s. Handed on these lessons as their own membership was going down to not much more than 50,000 by the early years of the Depression. They were training people for a new wave of battles yet to come. And finally, they did have one legislative victory, or half victory, the Railway Labor Act, which some of you on the airlines may not be too fond of. The airline workers are under that today. But here was the first piece of legislation to enable workers to pick their own bargaining agent and to set up mechanisms by which unions and railroad companies could consult with each other in the development of work rules and wage scales. Union membership slowly began to pick up again on the railroads, and in the 1930s burst forward till again the railroads became, I won't say totally unionized, they would have been totally unionized if they hadn't kept out the black workers, which is an important section of the railroad. So through their own doing was the only thing that was left to hold the railroads from complete organization over the course of the 1930s. But the 1930s saw this resurgence of energy and struggle that all of you know about so well. At first, the IAM was in a real bind because it had committed itself to organizing only journeyman machinists and found itself constantly in jurisdictional battles with other craft unions in the very same industry. Indeed, the AFL conventions of the late 1920s and early 1930s talked more about who has jurisdiction over whom than all other questions put together. This led to a rebellion in the ranks, demanding that unions bring in everybody in the same industry, regardless of their occupation, regardless of their race, creed, color, nationality, origins, regardless of their sex. And this cause of industrial unionism created not only much of the momentum of the 1930s, but also much of the conflict within the labor movement itself. At the convention of 1935, the American Federation of Labor repeated its commitment to craft unionism and voted down a famous resolution calling on it to favor industrial organization. And that's when the group of its leading people, led by John L. Lewis, set up a rival organization, the CIO, to go ahead with their program. But that very same convention is the one that gave the IAM jurisdiction over the aircraft industry. And here's one of the many ironies that history has to play on you. Because in the aircraft industry, those craft lines were often hard to figure out. And there was a rather small, relatively small group of highly skilled workers in what were often very small factories originally, who sort of worked shoulder to shoulder with the boss on technical problems, solving them, getting things done, trying to get a good engine made here. And then production workers that came and went. But it was clear if they were going to organize in the aircraft industry, they had to organize everybody. And although production workers and craft workers were initially often brought into separate lodges, not always. The aircraft industry really became the first place in which the IAM began in practice bringing in all grades of workers throughout the factory itself. And indeed had such an effect that by the early 1950s, more than a third of the IAM's members had stamped in their book production worker rather than journeyman machinist. And that led the next year to the IAM saying, what the hell do we have the distinction for anyhow? And abolishing it. You are a member, you are a member. It takes a great many years, but it was here in the dynamics of organizing the aircraft industry that this trend got started. And here too also that the first major contracts, negotiated usually quite peacefully in Boeing, Lockheed, so forth, were changed dramatically during the war years. So dramatically, let me point out, by 1938 there were 12,000 workers in aircraft production in the United States. 1940, 32,000. 1945, 280,000 workers in aircraft production. Here is an infusion of membership that was enormous, and an infusion of membership that put very new life into many of the locals. Many of those aircraft locals, Boeing, Lockheed, and so forth, became real spark plugs of struggle and change and innovation within the union as well as the industry over the course of that strike. And one of them, the Boeing 751, played an especially important role in breaking down the racial barriers of the union. Maybe some of you know similar stories from other locals. I would like to know them. As early as 1940, the Boeing Lodge voted to admit black workers. Its officers were called up on the carpet and expelled from the IAM. But the Union still then, as the war went on, gave work permits to about 140,000 black workers to come into the shops, even if they couldn't belong to the Union itself, but kept alive the pressure on the Grand Lodge to change this policy. In 1945, that Lodge 751 brought a resolution before the Grand Lodge Convention calling for abolition of the racial bar in the Union. They were defeated. But 1948 brought it up again, and this time it went through. And the IAM began a very new career of organizing people regardless of race or origin in its subsequent years. By the way, those Boeing people were also very important in legislation. They were the prime lobbyists to bring one of the first two State Fair Employment Practice Commission laws onto the books in the state of Washington in 1949. The aircraft industry, which had had such enormous orders during the war years, went down very, very drastically. And with it, the employers became much more aggressive in combating the IAM. And this led to some very, very long strikes. Boeing is out almost 3 years from 1948 to 1951, as the employers there are attempting to abolish any kind of union seniority clauses, to abolish any kind of a union shop, and to reinstitute full authority of the foreman to give whatever orders they want without being interfered with by any kind of shop steward. At the end of those years, the union went back intact, and indeed began a period of increasing collaboration between the IAM and other unions like the auto workers in the aircraft industry, and to develop pattern bargaining through all the Boeing plants around the country. Indeed, the great word of the 1940s and 50s is pattern. Everywhere unions were establishing standard wages for large areas. One of the most magnificent accomplishments was that of the United Steelworkers, which succeeded in abolishing the Southern differential. Every job in the South was paid about 17% less than those in the North. By 51, one scale throughout the Union. And this notion of a single standard then became crucial to the organization of industry-wide bargaining in the immediate post-war years. That pattern bargaining made it possible for the union sector to grow to about 45% of the workers in this country in manufacturing overall. But it also did something else. It meant that the unions were then defining for the whole country, including the bosses, what a good job was. And employers who had no unions started having to copy, set up some kind of grievance with senior, give some kind of lip service to seniority rights, set up pensions, all of these. If a union's doing it, we got to do it too. Became then the battle cry of the day. So here in those immediate post-war years, one could see the unions strong enough to pull up everybody, member and non-member alike, in the United States till about the 1970s. And then came what some people have called the great U-turn. When businessmen began increasingly simply moving out of unionized areas. Now, they're often done it inside the U.S., from Washington to first Omaha, then to Alabama, the plant would be moved. But now, it was possible to move the investments overseas and have parts produced all over the world and shipped to the United States. Then came really the sort of new mood of relocating industry, deregulating whatever was under government regulation, and in the wake of that, bringing concession out of the unionized sector, so that now the non-union sector began increasingly pulling down what was possible in the unionized sector of the land. That U-turn generated the world that we're living in and wrestling with today. A world that's sort of summed up by, Walmart and Enron, I guess. Walmart buys non-union produced goods from all corners of the globe, sells them in a non-union shop. Try and talk union if you work in Walmart. Puts on great patriotic banners for what they're doing here, but indeed the products are coming from the four corners of the globe, while Enron has demonstrated that the new managerial stripe isn't even worried about what happens to the company. They pocket themselves whatever is possible and then move on. And out of that came one of the biggest struggles in recent IAM history, and I sure hope that its history gets carefully, systematically written down by all of you. The 1980s counterpart of 1922 was Eastern Airlines. And Eastern Airlines saw on the one side the IAM mobilizing some of the most imaginative gestures of solidarity, imaginative strategies that I've ever come across in the union record. And on the other side, the famous Frank Lorenzo, who had his first interest to smash the union completely, but then after that, his main interest of all, he wasn't even interested in Eastern Airlines. And there was a big difference in 1922. You know, when the railroad companies smashed the unions in 1922, they wanted the railroads to keep running. Lorenzo didn't care if Eastern kept going or not. And you remember in the course of that struggle that the district and then Grand Lodge tried to counteract the battle for concessions in every possible way. They initiated a cost-saving campaign to show how it was possible to economize production. And the workers knew much better than anybody else what could be done. Nah, they still want concessions, said the airlines. Then they tried to buy out the airline. The court blocked that. Then they tried a public safety campaign to warn all the passengers of what was being broken down at Eastern Airlines. Finally forced into a strike in which President Wimpesinger called for a general secondary boycott. He asked all the major airlines in the country to stop work in support of Eastern, and all the railroads to stop work in support of Eastern. Sounded like the 1890s. The government quickly came down with a series of injunctions, driving everybody else back to work. The then existing leadership of the AFL-CIO just blanched and turned timid at the thought of a confrontation of this sort. And in the end, Lorenzo solved the whole problem by declaring bankruptcy and simply closing the company, selling off all of his assets to himself, to other things that he owned around the land. Here, indeed, was a picture of the kind of struggles that it was possible to face today, but also a very dramatic example of the kind of solidarity that could be mobilized in response to that struggle. And a picture, I think, that we will find very useful to think about in our own times. As I said at the beginning, it's crucial for us to tell these stories to the young, but crucial also to realize how through all of these battles, the IAM has always found the need to think, to find new strategies, new tactics, broader visions, and allies on the outside. And it's made its own ranks increasingly broad and diverse in doing this, but at the same time increasingly reached out its hand to others to aid them and to get their aid. And this pattern of local initiatives, concerted action, and concentration on national economic policy, I think, become some of the major lessons that we can draw from some of these great struggles in the past that will be necessary if we're going to turn things around again. Let me just say, in closing, that I was much taken with one remark of Congresswoman Tchaikovsky's when she started talking about the meaning of patriotism. I don't know how many of you know what the word meant when it first came into the vocabulary in the 1700s. Why were George Washington and Thomas Jefferson patriots? Why were the French revolutionaries patriots? A patriot was somebody who fought for la patrie, the country, against the aristocracy. That is exactly what the word meant when it first came into the vocabulary of human beings. And when we look at the world of Bush and Enron and Lorenzo, we see the question in front of us all. Who is it that stands for the country, for the whole of the people standing together? And there, I think, there is no place else to begin except in the union movement itself. And I hope that some of these lessons from the past, good ones and grim ones alike, may help us get some notion, not a blueprint for the future, it's a very different world we live in today, some notion of what kinds of struggles can be done and must be done to prevail in very, very hard times indeed. Thank you.